Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. The Secretary has called upon me this evening to read the paper which has long stood in my name, on the degrees of pure and ancient Freemasonry. In order to make myself generally understood, I think it best to lay before you at the outset what I might call a preliminary thesis. This will set the foundation before we go further. My object tonight is twofold. First, I wish to lay a sure foundation for a future inquiry into the early ritual and ceremonial forms which prevailed under the Grand Lodge of England. But secondly, and this is the stronger motive, I want to satisfy your minds that beyond all reasonable doubt, the essentials of the 3 craft degrees existed before the formation of the first Grand Lodge in 1717. More than this I will not seek to establish, though I hope that by the end you may incline to my own view, that the balance of probability favours attributing to our symbolic traditions as early an origin as to our written ones. If, by the close of our discussion, we can reach anything like a consensus that the ceremonial of Masonry predates the Grand Lodge era, then, brethren, a highly important object will have been attained. I hold firmly to this conviction, for if we can show that our symbolism, or at least a material part of it, can be proved to have existed before 1717, then the reluctance of competent investigators to enter the field of ancient Masonry will vanish, and with it, I trust, the disinclination to extend research into that only field of inquiry which offers any prospect of rewarding the patient student of our antiquities. Before we can meaningfully discuss this question, we must agree on our terms. When I speak of ancient Masonry, I mean the history of our craft before the year 1717. When I speak of modern Masonry, I refer to all that has followed after that date, the era of Grand Lodges. The line of demarcation, as I call it, is therefore drawn sharply at 1717. Above that line, reaching back to the 14th century, we find our written traditions. Whether our symbolic traditions are entitled to stand beside them, whether they, too, can claim a place above that line, is one of the questions I will discuss this evening. The scope of my inquiry is straightforward to state, though perhaps less easy to resolve. I wish to put before you certain speculations, always grounded in such fragments of evidence as have reached us, regarding the remote past of our society. These speculations are subsidiary to my main design, which is to show beyond all reasonable doubt that the essentials of the 3 craft degrees existed before the formation of the first Grand Lodge in 1717. I do not ask you to accept this merely as a matter of faith. Rather, I hope that by examining the evidence, you will see that our symbolism and ceremonial are not mere inventions of the 18th century, but survivals from a much earlier time. Survivals which link us directly to the operative brethren of the Middle Ages. This brings me to the central point of my address, my special contention. It is this, that the symbolism of Masonry is older than the year 1717. Alongside that, I hold a general contention that our symbolism, or at least a material part of it, is of very great antiquity, and that in substance, the system of Masonry we now possess, including the 3 degrees of the craft, has come down to us in all its essentials from times not only remote to our own, but also to those of the founders of the earliest of Grand Lodges. If, by the close of our discussion, we find anything like a consensus that the ceremonial of Masonry predates the era of Grand Lodges, then I shall consider that a highly important object will have been attained. There is also a secondary question I wish to place before you, a side issue, if you will, but one which bears directly upon our main theme. Is there reason to believe that the symbolism of our present Freemasonry existed in medieval times, and that it declined pari passu with the operative Masonry of that period? Might it be that what has come down to us is a legacy from the working Masons of those early centuries, a legacy stripped of much of its original meaning, yet still recognizable in its forms and emblems? This question allows us to consider not only the possibility of early origins, but also the processes by which meaning can be diminished while the outward forms endure. Before I press further with my main argument, let me give you a few historical facts, which, if kept in mind, will help you to grasp the complexity of the subject before us. It is well known that the first Grand Lodge, that of England, was founded by 4 London lodges in 1717. By common usage among students of the craft, the Masonry before that date we term ancient, and the Masonry after modern. For a time, the Grand Lodge proceeded without much change, until the year 1721, a date I ask you to remember. In that year, 2 important things happened. First, a great nobleman, the Duke of Montague, was elected Grand Master, and the society leapt into public notice and esteem. Second, Mr. James Anderson, a graduate of Marischal College, Aberdeen, and then a Presbyterian minister in London, was chosen by the Grand Master and the Grand Lodge to digest the old Gothic constitutions in a new and better method. These old manuscripts contained the legend of the craft and a code of regulations, once read to operative Masons at their admission, and they would form the basis of Anderson's famous Book of Constitutions. From this point, we can see clearly what the early Grand Lodge recognized in the way of degrees. In 1723, there were only 2, the apprentice and the fellow craft or master, the latter 2 terms being interchangeable. Regulation 13 of Anderson's Constitutions states that apprentices must be admitted masters and fellow craft only here, in the Grand Lodge, unless by a dispensation. But this changed in 1725. The Grand Lodge resolved that the master of each lodge, with the consent of his wardens and the majority of the brethren, being masters, may make masters at their discretion. Thus, in just 2 years, the restriction was lifted, and the making of masters became the prerogative of private lodges. These years, 1717 to 1723, have been called the epoch of transition, for many believe that in this period the system of Masonry we now know, with its 3 degrees, was manufactured or concocted. Here we arrive at a division in Masonic thought, 2 schools of opinion, each firmly held. One school maintains that the 3-degree system was indeed created in that transitional period, a new invention for a new era. The other is equally convinced that no essential alterations were made by the Grand Lodge of England, that any changes were confined to non-essentials, or, more precisely, to the method of imparting what was already known. As I have said, both positions are supported by respected authorities, and the evidence is finely balanced. My own course tonight is not to dismiss one side, but to put before you the arguments for the antiquity of our degrees, or, in the broader term I prefer, our Masonic symbolism. To illustrate my thinking, allow me to draw a comparison from a very different field. Unlike most nations, the civilization of Egypt shows a continuous decline from the earliest ages to the latest. The further back we look, the more consummate the art, the greater the mastery of mechanical skill. It seems that Egyptian civilization must have culminated before the very earliest dawn of its recorded history. And so, I suggest, it may be with our symbolism. There are portions of it, even today, to which no entirely satisfactory meaning can be assigned. Might it be that these too had their culmination before the dawn of our recorded history, and that they then declined? The process of decay halted only when the Grand Lodge took them under its care in 1717. Of course, there are those who argue the opposite, that our symbolism has advanced, developed, and refined since those early days, and that apart from a rough form of initiation, we have inherited nothing from our operative forebears. But for my part, I must pursue one path at a time, and tonight that path leads me to maintain the affirmative, that our symbolism carries with it a very respectable flavour of antiquity. To help fix the broader historical picture in your minds, I have set out a simple chart of the craft's development, century by century. In the 12th century, Mason's tool marks across Europe point to a Western origin, coinciding with the transition from Norman to the Gothic or pointed style of architecture, and possibly the first introduction of symbolic or speculative teachings among British stonemasons. By the 13th century, the Gothic style was in full development, and in England, the tool marks now suggest an Eastern influence, likely brought back through contact with the Saracens. The 14th century saw continued growth in England, but disruption in Scotland, where the wars of independence halted building and stunted the craft's progress. In the 15th, England endured the Wars of the Roses and a dormancy in both operative and speculative features. By the 16th century, the Reformation halted church building. In Scotland, lodges remained for trade purposes only, with ceremonial very simple. By the 17th century in England, operative lodges were surviving mainly for speculative purposes. Elias Ashmole's initiation in 1646 being a notable example, while in Scotland the old patterns persisted. And in the 18th century, we see printed references to Masonic signs and tokens before 1717, followed by the formation of the Grand Lodge of England and, later, that of Scotland. Let us now turn to the link so often made between Freemasonry and the rise of Gothic architecture. Three eminent names stand out: Sir William Dugdale, Sir Christopher Wren, and Elias Ashmole. John Aubrey records that Sir William Dugdale told me many years since that about Henry III's time the Pope gave a bull or diploma to a company of Italian architects to travel up and down over all Europe to build churches. From these are derived the fraternity of Freemasons. They are known to one another by certain signes and watchwords. It continues to this day. They have several lodges in several counties for their reception, and when any of them fall into decay, the brotherhood is to relieve him. The manner of their adoption is very formal and with an oath of secrecy. On the strength of such testimony, it was long customary to date the establishment of Freemasonry in England to the early reign of Henry III, coinciding with the introduction of Gothic architecture from the East, a bold and highly scientific style which, it was argued, must have been the work of chosen and selected artists. Valuable though such traditions are, we now have more tangible evidence linking the craft to the development of Gothic architecture in the form of Mason's marks. Our own brother, Professor T. Hayter Lewis, compared these marks from Scotland with those of other countries. He found that the surface finishing methods of the Norman style had a distinctly Western origin, but that in the 13th century, with the coming of the early pointed style, an entirely different method appeared, one whose source was apparently from the East. Some of the most prominent marks he showed had been in continuous use in Eastern countries from very early times. Brother Lewis rejected the idea that such a great change could be explained as mere gradual development, or by the collective efforts of monks and guilds. In every great movement which the world has seen, some one great mind comes forth as a pioneer, he said, nor did he think it otherwise in our art. His conclusion was that these marks, once thought of only sentimental value, may yet lead us to the place and to the means by which its influence was so powerfully and quickly spread. This brings us to a most intriguing hypothesis, that the early pointed or Gothic style may have sprung not from a school, but from a single master mind. If that was so, then, like the youngest son of King Athelstan in our old charges, of speculative he was a master, versed not only in the practice of the builder's art, but in the science of geometry itself. Such a man would have been both an operative and a speculative mason, uniting in his own person the two strands whose later separation would shape our craft. If indeed Gothic architecture was the work of such an individual, then the genealogy of the Freemasons, at least so far as it aligns with the rise of that style, would be intimately bound up with the vision and genius of that one great pioneer. As with all great artistic movements, the Gothic style had its zenith and its decline. After the perfection of the decorated style in the 14th century, inventive vigour began to wane, though beauty in ornamental work continued into the Tudor period. Under the Tudors, our Gothic went out, as has been said, in a blaze of glory, with the fan-roofed chapels of Windsor, Westminster, and Cambridge standing as final masterpieces. But the Reformation brought an end to the building of great churches, and with that the purpose for which Gothic had been devised. The suitable celebration of a gorgeous religious ceremonial was gone. As other means arose to instruct and inspire the people, the Gothic cathedral was repurposed, and the constructive principles, the processes, and even the traditions of the style fell into neglect. I ask, brethren, may it not be the same with our symbolism, that it too suffered a decline, never entirely lost, but surviving in diminished form, awaiting later revival? To illustrate the antiquity of symbolic thinking in the builder's art, I turn your attention far from Britain to ancient China. In the oldest of the Chinese classics, the Book of History, we find references to the moral use of the mason's tools reaching back to the 24th century before Christ. In another canonical work, The Great Learning, it is written that a man should not do to others what he would not wish them to do to him. And this is called the principle of acting on the square. The philosopher Mencius taught that those who pursue wisdom must also make use of the compasses and square, along with the level and the marking line, if they would walk in the straight and even paths of wisdom, and keep themselves within the bounds of honour and virtue. Our brother Challoner Alabaster has told us that, in China's earliest historic times, there existed a mystic faith expressed in allegoric form and illustrated, as with us, by symbols. The chiefs alone claimed full knowledge of its secrets. Its rites were performed in symbolic buildings like the Tabernacle of Moses or the Temple of Solomon. Its officers wore symbolic jewels and leather aprons marked with their rank. Turning back to our own medieval past, we find that symbolism in the mason's craft was not confined to solemn moral lessons. Our early operative brethren could be witty, even coarse, in their use of stone as a medium of expression. carvings survive that lampooned the clergy: a nun in the arms of a monk, a fox in priest's robes preaching to geese, an ass performing high mass. Yet alongside these satirical touches, there was a profounder art, what I would call the moralization of the implements of the trade. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the single object was to find suitable expressions for the heart yearnings and moral aspirations of the people. Whether instructive or irreverent, the mason's hand and chisel carried ideas beyond the merely functional, embodying principles and critiques in stone. Our written traditions take us even further back. The earliest is the Regius manuscript, dating to about 1425, a Masonic poem that gives the legendary history of our craft and rules for conduct. It tells how the science of geometry was founded in Egypt by Euclid and given the name of Masonry. What is remarkable is that the last 100 lines are almost identical to a non-Masonic poem, Urbanitatis, giving directions for behaviour at table and in the presence of ladies. Instructions clearly aimed at gentlemen rather than artisans. This suggests that the manuscript may have belonged to a fraternity that commemorated the science but without practicing the art. In other words, speculative or symbolic masons. Brother Albert Pike observed that many of the symbols of the old religions were geometrical figures. Geometry was the handmaid of symbolism. Symbolism, it may be said, is speculative geometry. If that is so, then in the Regius manuscript we have evidence that speculative thought was present in our craft's earliest surviving writing. From the Regius manuscript we move forward to the series of documents we call the Manuscript Constitutions, the oldest dated example being from 1583. These were read aloud to candidates of the operative class at their admission into the lodge, yet they tell us little of the actual ceremonial in use, especially for those accepted brethren who were not operative masons. In Scotland, lodge records show the trade-oriented nature of their work, but in England we have no equivalent detail for this period. In a sense, these constitutions are tombs without an epitaph. They survive, but they reveal almost nothing of the living Freemasonry of the time. When we compare England and Scotland in the 17th century, an interesting contrast emerges. In Scotland, the lodges existed chiefly for trade purposes, and their ceremonial was, by all accounts, very simple. In England, however, the lodges were not bound together by trade in the same way. This leads me to suspect that in the South, more of the old framework, and perhaps more of the old symbolism, survived. Sir William Dugdale tells us that the Freemasons are known to one another by certain signs and watchwords. The manner of their adoption is very formal. Dr. Plott, writing in 1686, confirms there was a plurality of words and signs. Such testimony suggests that, in England at least, a richer and more formal ritual tradition may have been maintained into the modern era. Some of our surviving documents hint at an organisational link between the craft and the London companies. The Harleian manuscript 1942 from the early 17th century refers to the Society, Company and Fraternity of Freemasons, governed by a master, wardens and a general assembly. It also uses the term accepted Freemason and requires such a brother to obtain a certificate from the lodge that accepted him. Another, the Antiquity manuscript of 1686, is attested as being written by Robert Paget, clerk to the Worshipful Society of the Freemasons of the City of London. While many students question their authenticity, others note that the three grades within city companies, freeman, liveryman, and member of the court, might have provided the framework for what would later become our 3 craft degrees. We come now to that great landmark in our history, the formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, often styled the Revival. But I do not use that term to mean the resuscitation of a pre-existing Grand Lodge. Rather, it was the reorganization of the society on a new basis. The late Brother Woodford put it well when he asked, "Where did the Freemasonry of 1717 come from?" He rejected the notion that so complex and curious a system could have been the creation of a pious fraud or ingenious conviviality, for the traces of antiquity are too many to be overlooked or ignored. I agree with him. It is not conceivable that the old London Masons would have calmly accepted a sudden metamorphosis of their forms and ceremonies. Moreover, there was continuity. Men like Anthony Sayer, our first Grand Master, and Jacob Lamball, our first Grand Senior Warden, remained active in the Grand Lodge well after the so-called epoch of transition. One generation does not retire, and another replace it in an instant. As Hume reminds us, one generation of men does not go off the stage at once, and another succeed, as is the case with silkworms and butterflies. Let me remind you that, at its birth in 1717, the Grand Lodge of England recognised only 2 degrees, apprentice and fellow craft or master, the latter 2 being synonymous. The fellow craft was, in effect, the senior or master workman, and in some lodges the master was simply the presiding officer. Yet by 1725 we find a clear reference to the master's part, an additional step which could be conferred in private lodges with the consent of the master, wardens, and a majority of the brethren. Whether this was a formal 3rd degree or simply a special communication of certain secrets is a matter of debate. But the fact remains. The years after the founding of the Grand Lodge saw the crystallization of our 3-degree system. I maintain, however, that this was not the invention of a wholly new system, but rather the reordering and formalizing of material already present in the older lodges. In other words, the essence of our craft, in ceremony, symbolism, and moral teaching, had been in existence long before the Revival. Before I close, I must address one more point: the relationship between the symbolism of our craft and the ritual framework in which it is conveyed. Symbolism is not static. It may be preserved in its forms, while its meaning is altered, diminished, or even forgotten. Our task as Masons is to recover and interpret those meanings. The emblems and allegories we inherit are not the casual inventions of the 18th century, but the survivals of a much older tradition, one that stretches back through the operative Masons of the Middle Ages and into the mists of antiquity. Whether in the chisel of the Gothic builder, the moral precepts of ancient China, or the allegorical carvings of the medieval cathedral, the language of our symbols is the same: a universal call to virtue, truth, and brotherly love. And so, brethren, if I have shown that our symbolism predates the Grand Lodge era, I hope I have also shown that it is not a dead inheritance. It is a living trust, one that we are bound to study, to guard, and to hand down, enriched, to those who come after us. We have journeyed together through the winding corridors of our Masonic history, from the earliest whispers of geometry in ancient Egypt and moral precepts in imperial China, to the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals and the careful chiseling of medieval craftsmen. We have stood beside satirical stone carvers and solemn moral teachers. We have opened the dusty folios of the Regius manuscript and the manuscript constitutions. We have watched the transformation of operative lodges into the speculative craft we know today. At every stage, we have seen one truth emerge: that our symbolism is no mere invention of the 18th century, nor the casual byproduct of convivial gatherings. It is the heir to centuries of thought and labour, a language of tools and emblems that has been shaped, refined, and preserved through war and peace, through splendour and decline. The forms may have altered, the ceremonies may have shifted, but the heart, the eternal principles of virtue, truth, and brotherly love, beats the same. I therefore submit, brethren, that the symbols we work with today are the survivors of a long and noble lineage. They connect us not only with our operative forebears, but with thinkers, builders, and moral teachers across all ages and lands. Our duty is clear: to study them with diligence, to guard them with fidelity, and to pass them on, not diminished but enriched, to the generations who will follow in our footsteps. And so, as we close, let us remember that every square, every compasses, every emblem upon our tracing boards speaks with a voice older than grand lodges and broader than our own craft. It is the voice of the universal brotherhood of man, calling us to build, not only in stone, but in character, a structure worthy of the great architect of the universe. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.